The morning began with a song from the birds that live near the lagoon. Their voices touched the still air before the sun reached the rooftops. Amina sat by the open window sewing the hem of a white dress. The fabric caught the light like quiet water. Her small sewing machine hummed like a heartbeat against the silence. Outside, the street was waking slowly. Children chased each other with wooden toys. Women carried baskets on their heads full of plantains and cassava. The smell of wet soil and smoke from morning fires mixed in the air. Amina smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed on the needle. She had learned to sew from her grandmother long ago, back when she lived in the red dust village far from the coast. Her grandmother used to say cloth has memory. It remembers the hands that touch it. Amina believed her because each stitch felt like a prayer she could not speak out loud. Her husband Musa had been gone for 2 years. The ferry took him on a quiet afternoon and never brought him back. People said the water was angry that day. They said storms rise without warning and mercy is slow to return. Amina no longer believed in anger or mercy. She believed only in work and in the silence between stitches. Her daughter Safiya was 12 now and full of restless light. She asked questions faster than Amina could answer. She wanted to know why the water could give and take at the same time. Amina only said because it remembers everything. The girl would look at her mother and whisper softly, "Does it remember him too?" Amina would nod and say it must, or else the world would not be fair. The clock on the wall ticked softly as if afraid to disturb them. From the window, Amina could see the far shimmer of the lagoon. Fishermen were pushing their boats into the deep line of blue. Every ripple caught the sun like a whisper of fire. She felt something inside her chest move like a bird remembering how to fly. She whispered to the water, "Bring me peace if you cannot bring him back." Safiya entered with her school bag and kissed her mother's cheek. The world outside was calling again, but the sound of water stayed in Amina's ears. It was the only voice that never left her. When Safiya left for school, the house felt too big for 2 chairs and 1 heartbeat. Amina folded the white dress and placed it beside 3 others waiting for pickup. She looked at the small jar of coins on the shelf and whispered, "Soon, my love, soon. We will pay the rent again." Then she tied her head wrap and stepped outside. The sun had begun to rise strong and the street was already alive. Vendors shouted over one another, their voices weaving through the air like drums. Amina walked toward the market carrying her basket and the soft fatigue that had become her shadow. She smiled at familiar faces, but her mind wandered to the lagoon, where the ferry had gone down. Even now the smell of water could tighten her throat. At the fabric stalls, she ran her hands across rolls of cotton and wax print. She always chose by touch, not color, the soft weave that forgave mistakes. The merchant asked what she was sewing today. Amina said life, and he laughed, not knowing she was telling the truth. On her way back, she passed the small pier. A group of children were playing close to the edge, throwing stones to see whose splash reached farthest. She wanted to call out for them to be careful, but stopped. The water must teach its own lessons, she thought. The water remembers what mothers cannot bear to say aloud. When she reached home, a letter waited under the door. It was from the cooperative office about a new loan for women tailors. She read it twice, her heart divided between fear and courage. The money could buy new fabric and another machine, but debt was another kind of drowning. She set the paper aside and began to sew again. The rhythm of the needle steadied her breathing. Every stitch was a small defiance against the ache of loss. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of boat engines starting. Amina looked toward the lagoon and whispered, "If you must keep him, then at least carry his laughter." As evening came, Sophia returned with chalk dust on her fingers and stories in her eyes. She said, "Mama, my teacher says grief makes us wise. Is that true?" Amina brushed her daughter's hair and said, "Maybe, but wisdom is heavy, my child. And tonight, I am just tired." The morning smelled of rain before the clouds even gathered. Amina always knew when water was near because her knees began to ache like old wood. Bending under weight, she told Sophia to hurry to school before the sky changed its mind. The girl laughed and said, "The sky only listens to you, mother," then ran off barefoot through the alley. Amina opened her window wide so she could see the lagoon while she worked. The surface looked quiet, but it carried 100 hidden stories below. She had learned not to fear it, only to speak to it gently, like an elder with moods. She said to it softly, "Keep your peace today. There is enough noise in our hearts." By noon, a young woman came to her door carrying a piece of cloth the color of dry soil after rain. She said her name was Zoya. She needed a dress for an interview at the garment factory. Her hands shook when she spoke, and Amina saw herself many years ago in that same nervous tremble. She told Zoya to sit and breathe before the needle began. The fabric was rough but honest, and by the time the hem was done, Zoya's shoulders had relaxed. When she left, she said, "Maybe this dress will remember to bring me luck." Amina smiled and said, "Cloth remembers kindness, not luck, so you must be kind to yourself." After Zoya left, the room felt lighter. Amina sat on the step drinking water from a tin cup. She thought of Musa's voice reading poems from his small notebook, and how his eyes followed words as if they were fireflies. She still kept the notebook in a tin box under her bed, though the ink had begun to fade. Sometimes she traced the letters with her finger and imagined him whispering the lines again. When Sophia returned that evening, she carried a wet ribbon and a question. She said, "Mother, if water can take people, does it also bring new ones back?" Amina looked at her and said, "Maybe not the same people, but maybe new reasons to keep living." Sophia nodded as if she understood, though her eyes looked older for a moment. That night, Amina could not sleep. The sound of waves outside was too loud, or maybe her heart was. She got up and opened her window again. The air smelled of storm and memory. She whispered to the darkness, "If you are still listening, bring me something worth staying for." And somewhere out on the lagoon, thunder answered her softly. The storm came before dawn, rolling across the sky like drums calling an old army. Amina woke to the sound of rain slapping the window and the sharp hiss of wind pushing through the cracks in the wall. She covered the sewing machine with a cloth and placed a bowl under the leaking roof. Sophia slept through most of it, her small breaths steady against the roar outside. By morning, the street had turned into a shallow river. Wood floated past like lost memories, and chickens huddled under broken carts. Amina wrapped a scarf around her head and stepped outside to see what the storm had left behind. The air smelled of wet earth and metal. Neighbors were already sweeping water from their doors and laughing because laughter is cheaper than despair. At the pier, a few wooden planks had come loose. Amina stood there holding her shawl close, watching the muddy water drag leaves downstream. She thought about how easily one day can change a whole life. She whispered to the lagoon, "You took him, But you also gave me a daughter who asks the right questions. When she turned to walk back home, she saw a child she did not know sitting under the awning near the bakery. The girl was barefoot and soaked, holding a small basket of oranges. Amina asked, "Where is your mother?" and the child shook her head. No one knew her name, but she said she came from across the water. The police would take her later, but for now she was just a child in a storm. Amina gave her a shawl and a piece of bread. For a moment, she imagined Musa standing there watching and smiling at her choice. The girl looked up and said thank you in a language that sounded like rain hitting metal. Amina did not understand the words, but she understood their meaning. When she returned home, the sewing room smelled of damp cloth and warm tea. She lit a small lamp and began to mend the dresses that had gotten wet in the storm. Each stitch felt like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. She thought of the lost child, of her own child, and of the man the water had taken, all of them pieces of the same thread. As night returned, the rain softened to a whisper. Sophia sat near the window, humming a tune she had learned from school. Amina joined her quietly, their voices small but sure. Outside, the lagoon shimmered again, calm now, as if it too was listening. Days after the storm, the sun returned bright but gentle, as if apologizing for the noise it had made. The lagoon shimmered again, and the smell of salt and clay drifted through the air, like memory coming home. Amina cleaned the sewing room and hung the damp clothes in the courtyard. Sophia helped her fold the dry fabric and count the spools of thread. It was then that the idea arrived, quiet as breath. She looked at her daughter and at the empty chair beside the sewing table. She remembered Musa's dream of teaching children how to read, how he used to say, "Every book is a seed waiting for a hand to open it." She thought maybe every needle is a seed too. Maybe she could plant them here and teach other hands to grow work from cloth. That evening she told Sophia her thought while they ate rice by lantern light. Sophia's eyes widened, and she said, "Will there be a bell, mother? And benches and maybe a sign?" Amina smiled. She said, "Perhaps if the water is kind and the rent stays patient." But Sophia was already drawing on the table with her finger, making circles for chairs and lines for windows. "This one will be my desk," she said, "this one yours." The next morning, Amina visited the market again. She asked Zoya, the young woman she had helped before, if she knew anyone looking for work. Zoya laughed and said, "Everyone is looking for work." "What kind?" Amina said, "The kind that pays in learning before it pays in money." Zoya nodded slowly. "That kind of work is rare, but I am not afraid of it." They cleaned the corner of the room and brought in an old machine from the warehouse. The men who delivered it said it would not last a month, but Amina only smiled. Sometimes things last longer when they are needed more. The first day they worked together, the sound of the machine filled the air like a song learning its own rhythm. Sophia sat on the floor, watching, her eyes shining with pride. Amina felt something move inside her chest. Not grief, not relief, something between both. She whispered to herself, "This will be our new ferry, not across the water, but through it." Outside, the wind carried the hum across the street. Neighbors looked up from their doors, hearing a sound that spoke of beginning again. The news of the sewing room traveled faster than the wind through the market stalls. By the second week, 3 women arrived together, each carrying a bundle of fabric and a shy hope in their eyes. They said they had heard of a tailor who taught for free and asked only for patience in return. Amina looked at them and said, "Patience is the first thread we will learn to use." The room filled quickly with sound laughter. mixed with the hum of the old machine, the slap of cloth against the table. Mirem, the oldest of them, sang softly while she worked, songs from her village about rivers and strength. Zoya helped her hold the fabric steady, teaching her how to guide the needle without fear. Even the walls seemed to listen, as if they had waited years to hear women's voices working. Instead of weeping, Sophia served water and swept the floor between lessons. She said, "One day I will teach too." Amina smiled and said, "You already do just by watching with your whole heart." At night, when the room was quiet, Amina counted the coins and the threads. She saw they had little money but much courage, and that was enough to keep the lights on. She told the water, "Thank you for bringing me these hands. They are not my loss, they are my beginning." Soon the neighbors began to notice the change. Men passing by would stop to watch the women cutting patterns on the floor. Children peeked through the window to see colors brighter than fruit. Even the landlord stopped one morning and said, "Your sewing makes the street feel alive again." By the end of the month, 10 women were learning. Some brought stories with them. One spoke of a husband lost to the mines, another of a child who needed school fees. They all carried something heavy, but in this room their burdens became fabric they could fold and reshape. When the evening light touched the walls, Amina would stop the machine and let the quiet settle. She said to her students, "Listen to that silence, that is the sound of the world noticing us." Then they would laugh softly and begin to clean the tables. Outside, the lagoon shimmered in the fading sun, as if it too was proud of the women who refused to drown. By the next season, Amina's sewing room had become a song the whole street could hum. Each morning before the sun fully rose, women gathered outside her door with folded fabric and open hearts. Some came to learn, others came only to sit and listen to the sound of hope. Stitched into cotton, the air around the small house smelled of soap dust and new beginnings. Inside the room, the benches were always full. Zoya taught the younger girls how to cut cloth on the bias. Mirem told stories that made them forget how heavy their arms were. Sophia practiced reading aloud from Musa's old books, her voice clear and proud as a bell. Even Tund, the boy from the next street, came back every day after helping his mother. He said sewing was like drumming, the rhythm mattered more than the strength. One afternoon, a woman named Kemi arrived carrying a child on her back. Her husband had fallen ill, and she needed to earn before the next harvest. She had never held a needle before, but her eyes were fierce with purpose. Amina took her hands and guided them slowly through the first seam. She said, "It is not the needle that makes beauty, it is the patience behind it." By evening, Kemi's stitches ran straight and sure. She looked at the cloth and said, "Maybe I can make life listen to me after all." The other women clapped softly, and someone began to sing a work song. Soon the whole room joined their voices, weaving through the sound of the machine. The music slipped out through the window and into the street. Children stopped playing to listen, and for a while even the wind stood still. That night, when everyone had gone home, Amina sat at the doorway watching the sky. The moon hung low and wide above the lagoon. She could hear water moving calm now, like someone breathing in their sleep. She thought of Musa and whispered, "My love, your books taught words, but these women, they are writing something new without pages." Sophia came and leaned against her shoulder. She said, "Mother, the street sounds different now." Amina smiled. "Yes," she said, "it finally remembers how to sing." The hum of the sewing room never really stopped after that. Even when the doors were closed, it echoed in every house nearby. a sound stitched from courage, laughter, and thread. Morning was quiet except for the soft chatter of birds nesting under the roof. Amina had sent the women home early because her hands ached and the needle kept slipping from her grip. Sophia was at school, and the house felt smaller without her laughter. The air carried the faint smell of the lagoon and the promise of rain. Amina took a deep breath and began to clean the corner where she kept her old things. Under a pile of folded fabric, she found the tin box she had not opened for years. Dust lay on it like a secret waiting to be touched. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were bits of thread, buttons, an old photograph, and a bundle of letters tied with thin string. They were Musa's letters written when they were first married. His handwriting was neat, careful, the kind that wanted to be understood. She unfolded one and began to read. He had written about the sea, about how the water spoke in many languages and how one day he would learn to translate them. He wrote, "If I ever get lost in the waves, listen for my voice in the sound of rain. I will always call your name through it." Amina's eyes blurred, and she pressed the letter to her chest. The wind outside shifted, carrying the smell of wet soil. It felt like the world was listening. She lit the small lamp and took out her notebook. In the quiet, she wrote a reply after all these years. She wrote, "The water did take you, but it also gave me strength. It taught me to stand when I wanted to fall, to listen when words were gone. And today your voice still lives in every stitch that holds another woman's life together." She folded the note carefully and placed it back in the tin box. Then she wrapped it in a piece of blue fabric, the color of Musa's favorite shirt. She whispered, "I am not angry anymore. You were right, the water speaks many tongues. I just had to learn mine." When Sophia returned, Amina called her close. She said, "My child, this box holds your father's voice. One day, when you are ready, open it and listen. The words will know what to say." Outside, thunder rolled softly. The lagoon shimmered like a mirror, catching the past and returning it as light. For the first time in many years, Amina's heart felt both heavy and healed. The story of Amina's sewing school began to drift beyond her street like fragrance carried by wind. At the market, women spoke of the tailor who taught others to stand again. Some called her teacher, some called her mother. Some said she was the woman who made sorrow quiet. A trader from a nearby village came one afternoon with bright patterned cloth balanced on her head. She said, "We heard of you, the tailor who gives courage with thread. Can you show us too?" Amina smiled. She said, "Bring your cloth, bring your hands, and bring your patience." By the next week, women from 3 villages came walking or by bicycle. The small room could no longer hold them all, so they spread mats under the neem tree outside. Under that tree, laughter mixed with the sound of scissors. Marembe sang work songs that echoed toward the lagoon. Zoya kept time by tapping her foot, teaching them how to match seams. Children ran in circles, chasing spools of thread that rolled like tiny wheels of color. Amina sat quietly, watching the scene grow around her like a garden. She thought of a day she had almost given up when the house had been too silent. Now the silence was gone, replaced by the music of hands learning to build life again. She whispered to the water, "You see, your loss became their beginning." Sophia brought chalk and wrote lessons on the wall. She had started adding numbers and words to the teaching. She said, "Mother, they must know how to count what they earn." Amina looked at her with pride. The girl had her father's calm and her own fire. The women listened, carefully repeating each number until the rhythm stuck. One evening, a man from the cooperative arrived with a clipboard and surprise on his face. He said, "We came to see if you still needed the loan you applied for." Amina looked around at the sewing room full of laughter, the mats full of women working. She said, "Keep it for someone who has not yet found her hands." He nodded slowly, as if understanding something that was not written in his papers. When he left, the sky turned red above the lagoon. The women packed their tools and said goodbye with tired smiles. Amina stood by the doorway as the last light touched her sewing machine. She whispered softly, "This is what healing looks like when it learns to breathe." The morning came with a letter that smelled faintly of dust and perfume. Sophia found it wedged beneath the door, the paper thick, the writing careful and curved. She handed it to her mother, saying, "Maybe it is from the landlord again." Amina smiled. "No landlord writes with ink this beautiful." Inside was an invitation from the city council. They were holding a crafts exhibition to celebrate women who built hope from their own hands. It said, "Bring your work, bring your story." Amina read the words twice before she could believe them. That evening, the sewing room was alive with excitement. The women gathered around the letter, touching it gently as if it might crumble under too much joy. Zoya said, "We will need our best cloth." Marem clapped her hands and began to sing a tune she called the March of the Mothers. Even the old sewing machine seemed to hum louder than usual. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing. Amina designed dresses made from patchwork pieces of donated fabric. Each color carried a story: blue for the lagoon, yellow for the markets, red for courage, white for peace. Sophia wrote small notes to pin on each dress telling who had sewn it and why. On the morning of the exhibition, the women walked together through the city streets. Their dresses caught the light and people turned to look. Amina felt her heart beating fast like a drum. The last time she had been near the water, she had cried. This time she carried her work across it like an offering. The hall was filled with stalls, the air alive with chatter and color. When it was their turn, Amina stepped forward to speak. Her voice trembled at first, then found its rhythm, like a song that remembers its first note. She told them about the fairy, about loss, and how the needle became her prayer. She said, "Every stitch is a memory, and every woman who learns to sew learns how to live again." When she finished, the room was silent, and then it filled with applause. Sophia stood near the edge of the stage, her eyes shining. Amina looked at her and felt the weight of years lift gently from her shoulders. That night, as they returned home, the sky above the lagoon glittered with stars. Sophia said, "Mother, I think Father saw you today." Amina smiled and whispered, "Yes, my child, the water must have told him." After the exhibition, the city did not forget Amina's sewing room. People came from different districts asking for dresses made by the women of the lagoon. They said there was something inside the cloth, something that felt alive when you wore it. Amina would smile and say, "Perhaps it is only the sound of women breathing together." Soon orders began to fill the small space. Bright fabrics piled high on every table, spools of thread shining like beads. The women worked with laughter and music, their hands moving fast but never careless. Marem said, "We are no longer sewing clothes, we are sewing blessings." And everyone nodded because they could feel it too. Amina bought a second machine. The first one had begun to cough, like an old friend tired from dancing. Sophia painted a sign above the doorway in blue letters. It read, "The Lagoon Tailor's Stitches of Hope." The paint ran a little in the humidity, but Amina left it that way. She said, "Perfection is not our story, courage is." One afternoon, a customer came carrying a camera. She said she was from a newspaper and wanted to take pictures. The women stood awkwardly at first, then burst into laughter when the flash went off. Zoya whispered, "Now the world will know we exist." Amina looked at her and said the world has always known, it only needed to listen. That week the article appeared with their photograph. It showed Amina and her students standing outside the sewing room, the lagoon behind them. The headline read, "The women who sewed the storm back to calm." People from far villages came with letters of thanks, and some sent fabric as gifts. For the first time, Amina felt the tide turning in her favor. When the evening came, she walked to the pier with Safiya. The water shimmered under a pale moon. Safiya said, "Mother, do you miss father still?" Amina answered, "Always, but missing is softer now. It no longer bites, it only reminds me that love can live quietly inside work." The wind carried the smell of fish and wet wood. Amina closed her eyes, listening to the small waves. They sounded like hands clapping softly, like the world saying, "Well done." The trouble began quietly, as trouble often does. A short wire, a tired socket, a moment's neglect while the women laughed over a story. The fire started small near the back wall, but the dry cloth caught it like breath catches flame. By the time they smelled the smoke, the room was already coughing. Amina shouted for the women to run to take the children outside. Safiya grabbed the small box of letters, clutching it to her chest as if it were life itself. Zoya and Merem threw buckets of water, but the fire only hissed and grew. The old sewing machine screamed as its oil caught. Within minutes, the air was full of ash and heat. When the flames were finally gone, the sewing room was black and still. The walls wept soot and the floor cracked from the heat. The women stood outside barefoot, silent, their faces lit by the trembling light of what had once been their dream. Zoya began to cry. Merem fell to her knees, whispering prayers. Safiya held her mother's arm and said, "We can rebuild." But Amina could not answer. Her throat felt full of smoke. That night they slept at the neighbor's house. Amina lay awake, listening to the quiet. She thought of Musa, of the fairy of loss finding her again. She wondered how many times a woman can begin from ashes before the wind stops helping. When dawn came, she went to the lagoon and stood barefoot at the edge. The water was calm, its surface soft and wide, like an old friend waiting. She whispered, "You took again, but I am still here." Her reflection shimmered, and for a moment she thought she saw him beside her. She smiled through tears and said, "I know you never promised it would be easy, only worth it." When she returned, Safiya was sweeping the remains with a small broom. The other women soon arrived, bringing bread and cloth and hands ready to work. Zoya said, "Fire cannot burn courage, it only tests its color." Merem began to sing again, her voice rough but steady. And slowly, with each sweep and word, the ashes began to look less like endings and more like soil. Amina found a needle in the debris, its surface blackened but still whole. She held it up to the light and whispered, "We will start again." The morning after the fire, the street felt strange and hollow. Ash drifted in small circles where laughter once lived. But before the sun reached the rooftops, the women began to arrive one by one. Each carried something different: a hammer, a broom, a handful of nails, a promise. Zoya came with her face streaked from tears, but her voice firm. She said, "The fire burned walls, not dreams." Merem brought her old radio, saying, "Music will remind the air of who we are." Even the children came carrying water and sweeping sticks. Amina stood watching them, all her heart full of ache and wonder. The men from the next street offered to rebuild the roof. They said you kept our wives strong, now let us keep you dry. Someone brought planks, someone else brought paint that smelled of sunrise. And little by little the ruin began to look like hope again. Sophia drew a new sign on a piece of cardboard. She wrote, "The Lagoon Tailors, we begin again." Amina smiled and kissed her forehead, saying, "You have your father's courage and my stubborn heart." Within a week the sewing room was standing once more. The walls still bore scars, dark marks that refused to fade, but Amina told the women not to cover them. She said, "Leave them as they are. They will remind us that beauty sometimes walks with pain." The women nodded, and the sound of sewing began again. On the day they reopened, the street gathered outside. Children clapped drums, played softly, and someone brought flowers wrapped in newspaper. Amina stood at the doorway, holding a candle. She said, "This light is for all we lost and for all we have found again." The women repeated her words, their voices joining like waves touching shore. Inside the machine hummed steady and sure. Every stitch that day felt like a heartbeat returning home. Even the air smelled different, like new rain after dry months. That evening, when everyone had gone, Amina sat by the window watching the lagoon. The fire had taken much, but it had also left her with proof that love can rebuild itself. Sophia sat beside her and whispered, "Mother, the stars are brighter tonight." Amina nodded, "Maybe they are happy. We kept our light burning too." The lagoon shimmered softly, holding both their reflections. And for the first time in many years, Amina did not feel alone. Months passed, and the sound of the sewing machines became the heartbeat of the town. The women no longer whispered when they worked, they sang. Their songs drifted through the alleys out to the pier and across the lagoon. Travelers who came through the market spoke of the music, of a place where women sewed strength into fabric. A newspaper reporter arrived again, this time from the capital. She took pictures of Amina's new sewing room, the painted sign, and the children laughing outside. She asked, "How did you rise after so many losses?" Amina answered, "The way we always do, one stitch, one breath, one prayer." The reporter smiled, and the next week the story appeared with the headline, "The Tailor Who Taught a City to Mend Itself." Soon messages began to arrive from other villages. They wanted to start sewing rooms of their own. They asked for patterns, for lessons, for the courage to begin. Amina and her women packed bundles of thread and small notes that said, "Start wherever your hands already are." Zoya went to the nearest village to teach for a month. Marem carried her songs further north, where the hills turned gold at sunset. Sophia wrote the names of every new school in a notebook, calling it the map of hands. Amina kept the pages close to her heart, saying, "Look, my child, the water remembers. Use now, not for our sorrow, but for our work." One day a letter came from the council inviting Amina to speak at a women's gathering in the capital. The others cheered and began planning dresses for her to wear. But Amina only laughed and said, "I will go as I am. The thread on my fingers is my finest cloth." When she stood on the stage weeks later, the hall was full. Women from cities and small towns listened as she spoke in her calm voice. She told them that loss is not the end of story, but the thread that ties it together. She said the world breaks us again and again, but we can choose what shape we sew ourselves back into. When she finished, the audience rose in silence, then clapped in a slow, steady rhythm. It sounded like rain on a tin roof, like the sound of life insisting it will not stop. That night, under the city lights, Amina stood near the water fountain and closed her eyes. The noise of the city became a song she already knew, the same rhythm her sewing machine had always played. beneath a gentle hand. The wrinkles on Amina's face deepened, but her eyes still carried the calm of water at dusk. The sewing room stood strong, its walls marked with stories instead of cracks. Children who once played at the doorway now returned as women, bringing their own daughters to learn. Amina no longer sewed as quickly as before. Her fingers had grown slower, her breath lighter, but her heart still moved with rhythm. She sat most days by the window, where the lagoon shimmered beyond the street. The same lagoon that had once taken. Everything now reflected all that she had rebuilt. Sophia had grown into a tall young woman, with her mother's quiet strength and her father's patience. She managed the sewing room now, teaching with laughter, scolding with kindness. She called the women sisters, not students, and they called her teacher. Sometimes she would catch her mother watching her and ask softly, "What are you thinking, Mama?" And Amina would answer, "I'm thinking the river gave me back what it once took, just in another form." One evening, as the sun lowered into the lagoon, Amina asked to walk to the pier. Sophia held her arm, and together they made the slow journey. The water was still, the air filled with the scent of mango trees and smoke from cooking fires. They reached the old wooden railing where once Amina had stood alone in grief. Now she stood surrounded by peace. She took the tin box from her bag, the same one she had carried since the fire. Inside were Musa's letters, a few old buttons, and a small piece of blue thread. She opened it and smiled. "The river has kept its promise," she whispered. Sophia looked at her, eyes wet. "What promise, Mama?" Amina touched her hand gently. "That nothing we love is ever truly lost. It only changes where it lives." She dropped the thread into the water and watched it drift, small and bright against the dark surface. The ripples spread outward, touching the edges of the lagoon, carrying her story further than she would ever go. When they turned to leave, the first stars were rising quiet witnesses to a life mended by courage. That night, as Sophia closed the door of the sewing room, she could still hear the hum of her mother's old machine. It wasn't running, yet the sound filled the air steady, warm, and alive. And when the rain began to fall outside, it sounded like a voice whispering softly through the window, "Keep sewing, my child. The water remembers." End of story. The water remembers. A story of loss, resilience, and rebirth. Amina's hands turned sorrow into strength, and her daughter carried that light forward, proving that love, like a river, never truly ends.